They called it the season of ash. Sirens gnawed the night. Lanterns bobbed in cellar mouths. Water buckets stood in neat rows like soldiers who could do nothing against a red sky. In Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, whole districts went to cinders under a wind that learned the language of firebombs. Families slept in their clothes. Children wore name tags around their necks. The Neighbors Association tonarigumi checked each doorway at dusk as if a roll call could keep the war outside. Then came the drills. In a schoolyard where laughter used to carry, teenage girls tightened the straps on cotton leggings and raised bamboo spears. A sergeant with tobacco-stained fingers showed them how to sink the sharpened end into a patch of bundled rice straw. In the next section of the field, boys in rough tunics practiced lunging at a wooden silhouette of a tank, a sackcloth satchel bong slung across a shoulder that should have been burdened only by books. A city official handed out mimeographed sheets with diagrams in thick black ink. How to blind a driver with cloth and lime, where to thrust a spear beneath the ribs, how to aim a bottle of gasoline when a soldier turns his back. The words were practical. The pictures were blunt. When the enemy comes, they said, you will meet him. There is a phrase that moved like a fever through those months. Ichioku gyukusai, 100 million shattered jewels, the poetic face of a promise to die together rather than surrender. It floated on banners, in the editorials of controlled newspapers, on the lips of teachers who had no practice telling children the truth about fear. It was joined by another word, older and colder, gyokusai, the military's euphemism for annihilation, presented as honor. Total war had come home. The home would be asked to be the front. But this is not a story of slogans. It is a story about how ordinary people in an island nation prepared, step by step, to meet an invasion that was certain in rumor and elaborate in planning, and at the same time, never came. It is about grandmothers sharpening kitchen knives at low tables, while a radio in the corner intoned about glorious sacrifice. It is about schoolboys who learned to dig slit trenches with the care they once gave to kites. It is about civil servants measuring rice by the spoon and black markets blooming in the shadows, because hunger does not care about ideology. By 1945, the war that had begun as empire had narrowed into survival. The U.S. Navy's blockade bit deeper each week. Coal was a rumor. Trains stuttered between cities on schedules that were more aspiration than promise. In March, a single night in Tokyo turned 97,000 houses into embers and sent rivers of people to the water, where they tried to outswim the heat. The sea was full of survivors by dawn. The streets were full of shoes without feet. In the corridors of the Imperial General Headquarters, in rooms where maps covered entire walls and pins marked divisions like a child's game turned serious, the plan for the home islands took shape. The word was Ketsu-Go, a decisive battle to make the invader bleed so much that negotiations could begin from a position that looked like pride. The geography of Kyushu and Honshu was dissected like a body on an operating table. Beaches were labeled with letters and numbers. Where would the Americans come? When? How? The answers shifted with each reconnaissance photo and each intercepted signal. The questions never changed. On the streets, the plan was simpler. The government would mobilize everyone. In June, an imperial edict created the Kokumin-gi Sentatai, the volunteer fighting corps, and in one signature broadened the army until it reached into kitchens, factories, schools. Men from 15 to 60, women from 17 to 40, those were the ages on paper. In practice, if you could stand and hold a tool, someone would find a use for you. There were not enough rifles, so practice meant broom handles and bamboo. There were not enough helmets, so straw hats did the job of courage. There were not enough illusions left, so the training was honest in its way. Here is how to kneel when you hear a mortar tube cough. Here is how to drag a body from a ditch without breaking more than has already been broken. And when the talk turned to the moment of contact, the instructors lowered their voices and spoke plainly. You will be closer to them than you are to me now. You will smell them. You will shout. You will not stop, because they will not stop. Across the water, the Allied plan grew into its own mass of arrows and timetables. Operation Downfall, 2 blows Olympic against Kyushu in November 1945, Coronet against the Kanto Plain in the spring that would follow. Analysts weighed casualty estimates that sickened even men who had made a profession of such arithmetic. They pictured beaches defended, not only by guns, but by people. They counted the kamikazes that might fall on the transports, like rain, the suicide boats tucked into coves like eggs, waiting for a hatchling's violence, the fields seeded with mines, the towns barricaded with timber and faith. Somewhere between those rooms and those beaches, between maps and lives, a nation prepared itself for a kind of battle that had never been fought on its core islands. The last time invaders had set foot on that soil in any meaningful way, the samurai wore armor. Now, with the iron taste of ash in their mouths, mothers sewed white headbands for sons and daughters. The cloth printed with characters that urged courage and reminded them of obligations that, in another era, would have belonged only to soldiers. If this seems distant, drift closer. Imagine an evening in a wooden house near Kagoshima. The sun cheats the horizon and the volcano, across the water, exhales a sigh of ash that coats the laundry lines. Inside, a man in his 50s, clerk's hands, the kind of shoulders that come from carrying ledgers, not rifles, ties a sash around his waist and unrolls the manual he has been issued. The paper is gray, the ink black, the language direct. He reads by lamplight while a pot of rice stutters on the coals, and his wife pries open a tin of sweet potatoes with a dull knife that has cut more rope than meat this year. Their daughter, 15, lays the bamboo pole across her lap as carefully as if it were a school instrument. The siren starts again. It's a false alarm, or not. The grown-ups don't show it. They go outside and look up. The sky is blank. Out in that blankness, plans collide with other plans. The ground waits. Before we reach the roads that would have channeled tanks, the caves that would have sheltered families, the lessons that would have taught a city to fight room by room, we will walk through the rooms where those preparations began. We will open drawers where armbands still sleep in mothballs. We will enter factories that moved under mountains. We will listen to the instructions that turned a modern nation into a garrison that included everyone. And then we will step onto the beaches of a place where invasion did come, Okinawa, and see in terrible detail the preview that taught Japan what it was, asking of its civilians, and taught the invaders what the mainland might cost. We will hear the radio on the morning, the voice of a god turned human, and asked a nation to stop. Between those points, we will meet a country that had prepared to be both fortress and funeral. War arrived in the cities long before any soldier in foreign boots. It came first as ration cards, then as shortages, then as the nightly performance of fear. The tonarigumi made lists. Who had a pump? Who had a shovel? Who had a well deep enough to be useful when the mains failed? Men learned to run with sloshing pails in the glow of 1,000 small fires. Women practiced with stirrup pumps, the water arcing in the alley, like sketch lines for a painting they didn't want to see finished. Children learned to beat sparks with wet brooms, to crawl when the air got sharp, to listen for the pitch change that meant the B-29s were turning into their run. The shelters were shallow and close. Yards grew mouths after the first raids, rectangles of earth pried open, timberberg roofs beneath a thin backfill, straw mats rolled near the entrance for quick covering. Families rehearsed the order of movement like a dance. Grandmother first, then the little ones, then the neighbors we cannot leave behind, then the father with the last bucket of water. Inside, candles burned in jam jars, their flames licking at the smoke ached into every surface. Small shrines sprouted in corners. Those who had loved ones already in uniform tucked their photos into niches near the doorway, so the first thing seen upon entering the ground was not the ground, but a face. Work did not stop. Factories moved into hillsides or vanished into the countryside in pieces. Machine lathes were installed in barns. Wings were riveted in school gymnasiums that smelled of chalk and oil. The state as demands bent the lines of daily life into shapes that would have looked absurd a decade earlier. A banker's wife stamping sheet metal, a poet rewiring radios, a boy whose strongest muscle had been his imagination, carrying sacks of coal from a truck that gasped more than it ran. Every train platform became a stage for leave-taking. Smiles were a vow, not a mood. Into that life came the volunteer fighting course. The armbands were simple cloth, the writing dark and assertive. The training, when weapons existed, began with obsolete rifles and a few cartridges whose brass gleamed with too much handling. When weapons did not exist, what could be found became a weapon. Bamboo, once a metaphor of resilience in poetry, became literal resilience when sharpened to a point. Blacksmiths made lunge mines poles, tipped with shaped charges meant to be thrust beneath a tank at the cost of the user's life. Bottles became gasoline bombs, each ragwick tied tight with a knot taught by someone who used to tie sails. In some towns, drills stretched into the night, the training ground lit by torches, whose smoke made a fake fog in which men's voices grew low. Manuals proliferated. Sheets with block prints showed how to drop a loop of wire over an enemy's rifle and jerk it free. Leaflets instructed housewives in the art of first aid. Then, in late sections written with clinical calm, the mechanics of killing at arm's length. One guide explained how to thrust a spear under the left ribs toward the heart, another how to pull a man off balance with his own belt. The language was both careful and shocking, anatomy told in the tone of a recipe. Teenage girls, who a few seasons ago had staged plays about harvest goddesses and loyal dogs, now tied white headbands across their foreheads and repeated motions until they became muscle memory. Yamato Nadeshiko, the old term for an idealized Japanese woman, sprouted calluses on her hands. Schools thinned. Evacuation trains pulled children from cities toward the countryside Gaku no Sakai, a managed unmooring. Lines of small bodies in small uniforms shuffled across platforms, each carrying a bundle wrapped in furoshiki cloth, each taught to keep a hand on the shoulder ahead. Villages received them with resignation and care. Temples and community halls filled with bunk beds, the air sweet with straw, and the many smells of 100 childhoods in one room. The older ones raised their younger schoolmates like siblings. The younger ones kept diaries, earnest and plain, and suddenly threaded with words like discipline and endurance. They learned to milk goats and weed fields, to make do with less while missing the city less with practice. Food shrank. Rice bowls held more barley, then sweet potato, then soup whose strength came from salt and memory. Lines lengthened at ration kiosks. The black market yamaichi set up in alleys and behind shutters. A housewife who had never haggled learned the art of trading a silk scarf for a handful of flour, and not looking as if it had broken her to do so. The phrase "eat now, worry later" lost its rhetorical flourish and became a strategy. Hunger is loud, and silence can be cultivated only on a full stomach. Tea, once a ceremony, became a thin green that stained the lip and was gone. Propaganda adjusted its color. Early war posters had shouted about victory, as if the mere act of printing the word could conjure it. Now the slogans spoke of preparedness, of unity, of the sweetness of sacrifice. A teacher taped a poster to a classroom wall. A mother in work clothes with a child strapped to her back, stepping forward with a bamboo spear, her jaw set and beautiful. The caption "Be your country's shield made glory domestic." In radio broadcasts framed by kodo music and stiff male voices the home ministry explained how to black out a window perfectly how to lay sand in the gutters against incendiaries, how to keep secrets from ears that might be listening, even if those ears were your own when they had grown careless. And yet there was a parallel language, one whispered in kitchens and over fences at twilight. How long can this last? Will they come here? Where will we go? The official maps stopped at city limits. Private maps crept up mountains, into gullies where caves had been since before men had written history. Outside Kagoshima, mothers pressed their palms to the faces of their children and told them with a calm that they stitched together like an extra garment for winter. How to run when the trucks came, and where to hide from voices that did not count to 10 in Japanese. On the coastlines, inlets sprouted shapes. Suicide boats shin'yō sat under camouflage nets, like animals who had learned to sleep in daylight. Young men with poor eyesight, who could not fly, and a seaman, love of engines trained to aim these pits of explosive at hulls, and accept that their last moment would be a waterline and a roar. In caverns carved into soft rock near Maizuru and Kure, sleek tubes hid a new weapon, a borrowed idea made into a grim art. Chitin, manned torpedoes that took a pilot inside what used to be a metaphor for death and made it into a job with a schedule. There were surprises, too, born of necessity. Entire factories moved underground munitions lines set up in caves, their entrances watched by guards who knew that a single bomb in that mouth would end a month's output and 100 lives. The wind carried the rattle of drills and the rhythm of hammers into fields where farmers bent to hoe weeds between rows of millet that would never be enough. In the hills above Nagoya, you could enter a mountain and find a foundry. The smell hot metal, human breath, candle wax did not belong under stone. It was there anyway. If the war had ended the way maps predicted tides of ships, planes and swarms, beaches that became cities of tents and smoke, the people in these scenes would have been the faces in the foreground. They did not know the numbers that the planners knew. Divisions counted like beads, aircraft massed on southern fields. They knew only the things that were theirs to know. The weight of a bucket when you run, the way a spear shaft flexes, the sound a child makes when she dreams of a house that is no longer standing. They knew night, and they knew hunger, and they knew that, in the morning, someone would blow a whistle, and they would learn something new about how to live through whatever was coming. If you want to understand what the mainland expected, you must go to Okinawa. There, the invasion did not exist in abstraction. It came ashore in surf that carried ships as far as the eye could hold. It lasted 82 days. The ground opened itself to trench and cave and bunker, and the people of the island were drawn into the weave of battle until there was no clean edge where civilian ended and soldier began. On Okinawa, high school girls in white blouses and skirts traded classrooms for caves, their school name Himeyuri forever attached to a hospital carved into limestone. They wrote neat diary entries in the dark, describing the careful tasks that earned them the affection of doctors and the exhaustion that made their hands shake, carrying stretchers slick with new blood, measuring doses of morphine they had not known existed the month before, cutting bandages from their own clothes when the boxes ran out. When the caves became targets themselves, the underground hospital turned from refuge to trap, and the girls learned a geometry of survival that paid no respect to innocence. Some died with their patients. Others walked out into a landscape where the only shelter was death's indifference. Families fled to caves, too. They brought into the earth whatever the surface life could spare. Pots, photographs, straw, a jar of pickles, a radio that could whisper even when the batteries were tired. There, the rumor that surrender meant slaughter grew into a certainty with each story carried from village to cave mouth. Leaflets fluttered that promised safety. Other voices, teachers, officers, neighbors, more zealous than informed, warned that the enemy would kill the men and defile the women, and that the only answer was to die as a family, as a community, with dignity that no invader could touch. Group suicides, a phrase that scrapes the throat to say, occurred in numbers that turned tragedy into a landscape. Grenades were shared among families who had never held anything more violent than a kitchen knife. When grenades were not available, rope and cliff and water completed the logic that fear had started. A mother, clutching a baby to her chest tightly enough to bruise, made a decision in a second that men in planning rooms would spend the rest of their lives trying to measure. Above and around that ground, the military practiced the home island's plan, Ketsu-Go, in miniature. Depth, not distance. When the beaches were breached, the defenders fell back to another line, then another, turning the advance into attrition. Kamikaze fell on ships and waves named after seasons Kaikasui, floating chrysanthemums, shattering decks, and breaking men's nerves. Near the reefs, shin'yō boats darted in the flotsam of battle and vanished in bright flowers of water and flame. The lesson, terrible and persuasive, was that a nation trained to make war from every yard of its soil could slow, bleed, and maybe change the calculus of an invader. The cost, measured in island households, was beyond arithmetic. On the mainland, this picture was study and prophecy. The generals rearranged their pins on Kyushu and traced arcs of artillery fire with rulers. They moved divisions south, siphoning units from China and Manchuria, despite warnings that to empty one front was to invite collapse elsewhere. By August, hundreds of thousands of men were dug into the ridgelines behind the beaches the Americans marked on their own charts near Miyazaki, Ariake Bay, Kashikino. Airfields sprouted on Kyushu like rash, each with the same promise. When the ships come, we will lift and fall and fire ourselves into their sides. The number of aircraft available to fly suicide missions multiplied on paper beyond what fuel and pilots could support. This, too, was part of the plan. An army planning with its will eased the fear that its logistics could not. The volunteer fighting corps grew in shadow under these larger movements. In cities around Kyushu, schoolboys made wooden mock-ups of M1 rifles and learned to charge at caution tape that marked a trench lip. Housewives attached bayonet fittings, simple metal sleeves to poles, turning agricultural tools into a semblance of military issue. Instruments of a different war, the lunge mine, the satchel charge. The ceramic grenades sat in crates in municipal offices, signed out with a flourish and a bow to men who brought them home like responsibilities. In fields where peanuts should have been pulled, men practiced forming into hedgehog formations to meet tanks. Pamphlets taught how to wedge timbers into treads, how to thrust at the driver's hatch. Kong diagrams coexisted with the shaky knowledge that a tank is a noise that overrides instruction. Across those preparations lay a net of sudden authority. The neighborhood association head, a shopkeeper before the war, could now call a drill that would empty a block into the street in less than a minute. The police quieted grumbling with reminders that listening to the radio of the enemy carried punishment. The special hire police, the talk, pried into conversations that used to be safe under the orange tree at dusk. A word like worry acquired consequence. A sentence like, "Maybe the war will end soon," became both prayer and risk. Posters hushed skepticism with calls to unity. Slogans, 100 million with one heart, whispered over the unease, like snow seeding the air before a storm. The home became a workshop. Women learned to make amagotsu straw overshoes for soldiers, their fingers bleeding into the straw, until the sandals were both artifact and offering. Little brothers took apart radios on tatami mats and handed over their parts to collection drives that promised to turn copper into bullets, vacuum tubes into victory. In towns where lathes whirred after curfew, craftsmen turned out Arasaka bolts and bayonet frogs and believed the delivery truck. Headlamps like a child believes a ghost story. They wanted to be scared because fear felt more honest than optimism. Meanwhile, the blockade strangled. Rice paddies yielded less. Fishers crawled across the sea in boats that coughed smoke from cut wood because oil had become a memory. In markets, the prices chalked on boards were fiction. Reality lived behind the stall, where the seller met buyers' eyes and made judgments born of fatigue. A widow with 2 children had always lived at the edge of town. Now the edge moved, as she lived beyond it, in a camp of tarps stretched over bamboo where steam rose from pots at dawn like breath. In kitchens, new recipes were born of necessity and stubbornness. A flatbread of millet and chestnut meal. A syrup of sugar beets boiled down until a child could lick sweetness from a spoon, as if it had been captured by magic. A porridge so thin it could not hold an adjective. Hunger became a backdrop, then a character. Hunger made stubborn people more stubborn, and soft people harder. It made moral choices taut. Sell the silk kimono inherited from a grandmother, or not. Never wear it in victory anyway, so sell. Trade the family sword? No. Lock it in the chest and pretend it is not there. Each decision twisted the string that bound tradition to survival. Every family kept a plan. When you hear trucks on the road at night, and the voices are wrong, go. Hide in the cane near the river. Listen. If you hear a language you don't know, become stones. If you hear the phrase that means, come out, do not. Wait until a face you recognize crosses the road. If they call your name, come out with your hands at your sides where they can see them. If they raise rifles, drop. If you must run, run toward the alley that bends twice, not once. The plan felt like a bulwark against the unplannable. Sometimes it worked as a lullaby. The planners on the other side, in air-conditioned rooms built in islands that had cost blood and steel to take, looked at weather charts and landing tables. Their estimates for casualties American and Japanese varied, but the trend was always up. The codebreakers listened and learned the names of units that Japan had moved to Kyushu. The casualty envelopes prepared by clerks in bases names for men who had died earlier in the war grew thicker. The voices that counseled blockade and bombardment, only the slow squeeze, not the quick cut, grew more persistent. In Washington, numbers fought with duty. In Tokyo, duty had learned to ignore numbers. On Okinawa, the cemetery called Mabuni grew by the day. On the mainland, schoolgirls washed their hands after practice and tried to scrub out not dirt, but feeling. Between these places stretched a sea full of ships, and above it a sky that would soon carry something no one in any whispering kitchen could imagine. But in those weeks before the unimaginable, it was the imaginable that consumed them. A knock on the door, the roll of engines on the coastal road, the taste of dust raised by columns of men who might be theirs or might not. The invasion had a date on one set of calendars. On the other, it was tonight. In late July, the air changed. Not weather, although the heat was a wet cloth laid across every face but tone. Leaflets fell over cities with a regularity that felt like rain in a dry season. They were soft in the hand and hard in their message. The war is lost. Your leaders continue it at your cost. Surrender now and live. Some leaflets were lists, naming cities that would be bombed next with an earnestness that made them feel like warnings from a neighbor rather than threats from an enemy. People took them into their kitchens and laid them on tabletops. Some saved them in drawers with the sudden understanding that the paper in their hands was a timeline. Others burned them in hibachis, as if words can change their nature with smoke. The Potsdam Declaration made its way into the newspapers as official silence and editorials that felt like speaking while covering a mouth with a hand. The language of unconditional surrender clashed with a nation's sense of itself. The army spoke in numbers of divisions and aircraft guerrilla tactics and decisive battles. The Navy spoke in a quieter tone, burdened by the knowledge of seas controlled by others. The court spoke in honorifics, carefully, weighing 1,000 years against the next 1,000 days. Then came August, and with it a light over Hiroshima that erased shadows and left their outlines on walls. The aftermath is familiar in photographs. A city made into a map of itself, the human reduced to measures of radiance and silence. Those photographs did not arrive immediately in the places that mattered. What reached kitchens and barracks first were rumors dressed in the clothes of myth. A single bomb that could flatten a district, a sun that rose at ground level, a wind that stripped the skin of children like summer fruit. Before the mind could settle, there was Nagasaki. In the north, the Soviets crossed into Manchuria with the blunt force of a wave hitting a shoreline that only remembered the echo of previous wars. News moved from mouth to mouth, fast in some corridors and slow in others. Armies that had promised to hold a line found the line melting. Training did not stop because the sky had turned new and terrible. In Yamashina, a platoon of volunteer fighting corps practiced on a hillside under a sky that held no planes. They gripped their bamboo and ran forward when the whistle blew and imagined an enemy on every ridge. In a narrow street in Kokura, a boy traced his finger along a leaflet that named his town. He waited. A woman in Kagoshima sharpened a kitchen knife while a neighbor told her that the Russians were coming and that the Americans would be kinder. And she tried to connect that sentence to anything she had known about the world since she was a child. On August 14th, the cabinet meeting stretched into a day and then a night. The voices in the room measured honor and annihilation with the kind of precision that leaves grooves in a table. The emperor, whose voice the nation had not heard in any register other than ceremony, spoke on the side of peace. In the morning, the radio, filled with static, resolved itself into words that people would remember not as a speech, but as a pressure in the throat. The Gyokyuan Hosp, the jewel voice broadcast, came from a set glowing in a corner, or from the loudspeaker mounted on a pole in a village square, or from the tinny radio in a factory where the foreman called everyone to gather. The sentence that struck hardest was simple: to endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable. In a schoolyard where girls had practiced spear thrusts, the headmistress stood straight while the broadcast ran, and then let her shoulders drop in a way that no student had seen before. In a coastal village, a fisher's wife stared at her armband and took it off. In a town in Kyushu, a man who had spent 2 nights in a cave at the edge of his garden with his family, because the rumor had been that the Americans were on the road, turned to his wife and exhaled something between relief and grief, and said very softly, "We will live." In a barracks, an officer who had told his men that surrender was worse than death now counted those men with gratitude and the haunted, thin fear of what would be required to keep them intact in a world that had changed shape in an hour. Not everyone heard. In some places, the recording crackled too much to penetrate, and men and women leaned in with puzzled faces and caught only the placing of blame on a weapon cruel and monstrous, and a tone that was sorrow dressed in formal clothing. In others, a prefectural governor's office took a breath and then issued orders calm and practical and immediate. The volunteer fighting corps is dissolved. Turn in weapons and armbands at the temple by dusk. Bells will ring in the morning. Do not riot. Do not kill each other out of principle. Some did not obey, because turning off a war is not like turning off a pump. Caches of lunge mines were dug up and handed over to men in uniforms who logged them with pencils that had never touched paper for such a purpose. In certain villages, the first Americans arrived within days tall, thin from their own long campaigns, bearing cigarettes and chewing gum, as if the landing on this shore was not the event it would have been a week earlier. A woman bowed too deeply, and then laughed in embarrassment, when the soldier she bowed to fumbled his hat and bowed back with a sweetness that disarmed something in her chest. A university student raised on the idea that foreigners were a category, not a collection of people, listened to an American's Japanese, and realized that the war had changed even words. Children touched fabric and boots with a curiosity that had been building for months. In the cities, firemen hung their helmets on pegs and ran their hands over the dents one last time. The tonarigumi leaders took down the lists and wrote new ones. Who needs food? Who has a mother alone? Who has family missing in Manchuria? Black markets surged, now not as resistance, but as survival. Factories that had moved under mountains stopped their machines and carried them back out into the light. The work of building a defeat began, and it was work at once humiliating and humane. Letters reached kitchens from faraway islands, from ships, from hospitals inland. A girl named her fear, now that naming was allowed. A boy brought home a leaflet he had saved not because he believed it, but because it had been the first foreign paper he had ever held, and it smelled different. Teachers, their voices different with constraint fallen away, spoke to their students about how to think in a country that had told them what to think for years. A lesson: we can hold two truths, that we fought and that fighting is no longer our job. There were darker threads. In certain places, soldiers killed themselves in groups rather than live beneath the shame they had been taught to fear more than death. Families who had believed the worst of the invader found that belief hard to surrender, even with peace declared, and would not come out of caves for days, their eyes narrowed against light and the future. Some leaders tried to continue the old story, told patrols to seize weapons, to punish defeatism. They quieted quickly, not by force, but by the sudden lack of gravity to hold their orders to earth. In the weeks that followed, women brought armbands to shrines and laid them carefully on steps that had known the weight of offerings and the scrape of straw sandals for centuries. A priest stood and accepted them the way he would accept anything offered with sincerity. At night in houses that now echoed with the absence of sirens, men and women took out diaries and wrote not about bamboo or bombs but about rice and roofs and children asleep with their mouths open and their hands finally unclenched. The invasion that had lived in drills and manuals, in the sharp smell of oil on wood, in whispers, did not come. It left behind the shapes it had imposed, the caves with their mouth-like entrances, the field lines bent to barricade, the muscles taught to thrust and pull and brace. It left behind relief, braided with the knowledge of what had been asked and what might have been. History likes clean edges, invasions with dates, surrenders with signatures, a line drawn, a lesson noted. But the story of how Japan's civilians prepared for invasion resists the comfort of clarity. It spools itself into kitchens and alleys, into schoolyards and caves, into the corridors where men in uniforms made plans that reached into the hands of people who had never worn a rank. It is a story about mobilization and imagination, about the facts of logistics and the fictions that people need to believe in order to face an enemy they cannot see yet. What would it have looked like if Operation Downfall had taken place? Some historians lay numbers on the table. Millions dead on the Japanese side, hundreds of thousands on the Allied, a country scarred not in maps, but in the intimate geometry of families. Others argue for different strategies that might have ended the war without landing on those beaches. The arguments are honest and ongoing. What does not argue is the evidence of preparation. The armbands folded away in drawers. The bamboo spears still stacked in school storerooms decades later. The cave mouths blackened by smoke and memory on hillsides near towns that now sell ice cream to tourists in summer. In present-day Okinawa, a peace memorial park lists names without rank, without division. The stone reads like a telephone book for an island, where fisherman and nurse and student and soldier share space, because death during those months refused categories. In Tokyo, the corner of a quiet ward holds a museum display of civil defense gear, a stirrup pump, a metal helmet, a pamphlet with drawings that are too bright and too plain. A bamboo spear leans in the glass case. It looks both trivial and obscene until you imagine it in a girl's hands at dusk, the practice field lit by lanterns, the insects loud, the teacher's voice tired and careful. The volunteer fighting corps did not meet the invader, but the idea that it could have had already changed the country. It had turned private houses into public spaces, neighbors into unit members, fear into action. It taught a generation of women the peculiar autonomy of necessity, how to lead during a drill, how to stand in front of men and issue orders, how to ignore eyes that had never expected to receive them. It taught a generation of boys a posture that was useful even after the spears were stacked again in closets. How to stand up straight and answer without flinching, not to a superior officer, but to a life that had become more complicated than their fathers had promised. The memory of that mobilization is double. For some, it is a badge. We were ready, we were brave, we would have fought for our homes. For others, it is a warning. This is how a state turns love of place into obedience, then obedience into the willingness to put a child in front of a tank with a bomb tied to her waist. Both truths can be held together without betrayal. In the story of preparation, you can see the virtue of community neighbors. Checking on neighbors, people learning skills they'd never imagined, and the vice of coercion whispers. Reduced to silence, dissent turned into treason of the lowest order, the individual absorbed, until the self was only a function. And in the middle of those truths is a quieter one. People lived. They cooked and sang and married, and raised children, and sold fish, and washed hems, and studied for tests, because life is ordinary, momentum is strong. They practiced with bamboo, and they also pulled weeds, told jokes, watched street dogs with a tenderness that betrays our species as reluctance to let horror carry the day. They were not a faceless population waiting to play their part. They were a collection of people with names, and the invasion, if it had come, would have come for those names. The call to action that this story offers does not live in the realm of policy alone, though policy is the place where wars are often averted or invited. It lives in the everyday habit of refusing to let a government, any government, conscript imagination for war without a fight. It lives in the choice to keep neighbors as neighbors first and units second, to insist that the training we drill into our children is for rescue more than assault, for carrying more than killing. Read the pamphlet again and imagine rewriting its last pages. Where it shows where to thrust the spear, imagine a diagram of a tourniquet. Where it shows how to sabotage a tank, imagine instructions on how to build a stove from a can for a family in a blackout. There is also a particular lesson in humility. The decision that prevented an invasion and unspooled the preparations was made far above the kitchen table and the practice field. It was made in rooms heavy with history by men conscious of everything they carried. And yet, even that decision had to move through the hands of ordinary people. A technician who set a record needle on a disc. A radio operator who adjusted a dial until static became words. A school teacher who told her students to sit and listen. A mother who recognized the phrase about enduring the unendurable and felt something unclench in her chest. Japan wrote a pacifist constitution in the aftermath. Article 9, a sentence that has been parsed, defended, amended in practice, if not on paper. The country rebuilt as a nation whose preparations turned toward earthquakes and typhoons, whose sirens meant flood and fire more often than planes. And that shift is not only policy, but memory. The bamboo spears did not end up on mantles. They ended up, when not collected and burned, in storerooms covered in dust, or in museums, or cut down again into garden stakes. The energy that had taught children to duck and cover now taught them to brace and shelter, to check on elderly neighbors during a storm. It is not a perfect trade. It is not even always clean, but it is a trade worth celebrating. Walk today along a beach in Kagoshima, and the only lines in the sand are drawn by wind. The caves are there, if you know where to look, mouths scalloped by time. Their graffiti now names and hearts carved by teenagers, whose grandparents may have stood watch there, with jars of rice, and a fear no adolescent can imagine. In the city, a subway rushes under a ward that used to be ash. A woman in a uniform sells boxed lunches with a bow. In a schoolyard, children run with kites, their feet quick with a freedom that their great-grandparents rehearsed a different way. A museum volunteer, who once was one of those children evacuated to the countryside, tells a student group, without bitterness, that the human heart can be trained for many things, and that it is our job now to choose the training. When Japan's civilians prepared for invasion, they were asked to become more than they had imagined and less than they deserved. They boasted, grieved, sharpened, drilled, doubted, obeyed, resisted in small ways that matter. Hiding a son from a draft with a falsified age. Handing a rice ball to a girl with a spear when the drill ended and saying, "Eat." Telling a rumor to stop at the fence. They stitched an invisible net between them that would either catch each other if bombs fell or hold fast when peace arrived. Peace arrived. Remember the armbands returned to shrines and temples. Remember the bamboo poles stacked neatly in corners. Remember the diaries with entries about drills next to pages about sunsets. Remember Okinawa's limestone, damp and echoing with the breath of people who deserved more time. Remember that plans were made that would have required of civilians something impossible, and that their preparation was not a fever dream, but the honest work of people who believed that if this was what history asked, they would find a way to answer. And then look around. What are we preparing our civilians for now? What do the drills teach? Who holds the megaphone when the siren sounds? And the answer is the measure of whether we have learned what the war wanted to teach, but could not without leaving scars. Let the next manuals we write be about endurance that builds rather than breaks. Let the next armbands carry symbols of relief. Let the practice in our schoolyards teach children how to run toward each other, but this time with water, blankets, and hands held out, ready to carry, not to kill.